In 1941, a 21-year-old British subaltern named Douglas Collins was stationed at a quiet Irish pub, drinking in the local charm and dreaming of a peaceful end to the war. But his commanding officer had other plans. The colonel called his men together to ask for volunteers for a vague deployment somewhere in Africa. When no one stepped forward, Collins was detailed, drafted into the mission entirely against his will. He had already survived the mud of France and the desperate, chaotic evacuation of Dunkirk, and he desperately wanted a quiet assignment. Instead, a young soldier who had just escaped one of the war's worst disasters was unknowingly sailing straight toward another. The catalyst for his deployment was entirely geopolitical. General Cunningham's forces had just pushed north into East Africa, prompting the Italian military to abruptly abandon their outposts and flee toward Ethiopia. This map shows the Horn of Africa, where the sudden Italian retreat created a massive, lawless power vacuum spanning the entire region. We're talking about an 1,100-mile stretch of coastline, running all the way from Cape Guardafui in the north down to the Kenya border. To prevent total anarchy, the British hastily assembled a makeshift police force, which they called the Somalia Gendarmerie. There was just one glaring problem with the plan. The force was led by a tiny cadre of completely inexperienced, rapidly drafted young officers. The fate of an immense, volatile territory now rested on the shoulders of naive kids with virtually no resources to govern it. Collins arrived in the sweltering, ancient port city of Mombasa, entirely oblivious to the stakes of his new mission. A hardened, sun-baked British major conducted the interview. He ignored standard military credentials, focusing instead on a single question: did Collins play cricket, soccer, or rugby? Satisfied with his sporting credentials, the major abruptly assigned Collins to an isolated outpost known only as the Furthest Shag, a local term for the deep, unforgiving desert bush. Collins left the tent thinking he was heading to a civilized sporting outpost, completely blind to the geopolitical furnace waiting for him. The military convoy rolled out, leaving the paved streets and comfortable colonial architecture of Nairobi behind. They crossed a hasty military pontoon bridge spanning the Tana River, physically passing the threshold into the unknown. Almost immediately, the environment turned hostile. Endless stretches of burning red sand replaced the roads, and water became terrifyingly scarce. The brutal daytime heat eventually gave way to an eerily beautiful night, broken only by the grunts of lions and the silent shuffle of ghostly camel caravans. The desert itself became their first true adversary, stripping away any lingering illusions of a comfortable deployment. The true power in this region didn't come from London. It belonged to the nomadic Somali tribes who had mastered the landscape. They possessed extreme physical resilience, capable of surviving for days without water, simply by altering their diet to avoid thirst. Psychologically, they were fiercely proud, deeply loyal to their specific clans, and carried a generational memory for any insult or wrong. In close-quarters bushfighting, they relied on lethal traditional weaponry, carrying stabbing spears and wicked double-edged knives. But the danger was amplified by a modern threat. The retreating Italians had left behind .256 caliber rifles, which the locals repurposed and simply called bang sticks. Collins found himself attempting to govern a society of highly adapted, heavily armed survivalists, a population that had mastered the terrain and answered to no one. After grueling travel, the convoy finally halted at the remote outpost of Bardera, situated right on the edge of the Juba River. As the sun set, the young officers gathered around a lonely desert grave belonging to Lieutenant Elliot, a former British commander. The local interpreter recounted the brutal history. Elliot's camp had been wiped out by a massive raiding party of 300 warriors from the Alihan, a powerful local tribe. The rules of intertribal warfare here were absolute. Battles were ruthless. No mercy was asked or given, and prisoners were routinely left to the knives of the victors. The grave stood as a physical warning. The desert did not tolerate naivete, and the penalty for an administrative failure was death. Standing over the murdered officer's grave, Collins' mindset from the quiet Irish pub felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The illusion of a cricket-playing colonial adventure had burned away entirely in the heat of the shag. The naive boys of the Somalia Gendarmerie were forced to grow up overnight, tasked with managing a territory that had been abandoned by two colonial powers and remained fiercely ungovernable.